You're absolutely correct on that. There is a perception problem that people believe that the federal government provides the services, that because they give the money, that money will be spent in the way that the federal government has told the provinces or suggested to the provinces that they will spend the money. But the provinces have that authority to take the money and spend it on healthcare. It's in the Constitution, and it is a separation of authority or power. What our party is saying is that for too long, we've had finger pointing from the provincial government at the federal government for funding, and the federal government saying we funded for this particular issue. And there's a confusion that's been allowed to develop within the community. The PPC is going to take the GST funding that we have right now. It's about $41 billion that the federal government draws on GST. And we are going to give that taxing authority to the provinces with the idea that they then take that money and support their healthcare systems with it. What that does, it doesn't improve, it doesn't take away from the healthcare system or the financing, but it squarely puts the responsibility for healthcare where it belongs. So when you go to Diane Finley or have been to Diane Finley, you won't go there next time. You go to Toby Barrett, and Toby Barrett will be responsible, or whoever government is in place at the time, for healthcare services. And it focuses our concerns and our issues where it belongs, and that is with the provincial government. They supply all the frontline services. The federal government doesn't do any of that.
I get it, but you send the federal government sends the money to the province. And what I'm saying is the federal government needs to have some kind of guidelines of what the people want for the province. That's all I'm saying. That should be a change.
The federal government applies the philosophy of universal health care in the application of Health Canada. There are certain rules and regulations that they can impose, certain restrictions that they can apply to transfers of money, but they cannot make the province do what they want to do. It's strictly within the bounds of the Constitution that the province controls frontline services and application of healthcare services to the communities. We're saying, well, there's confusion, and I hear confusion here right now, that the federal government can actually step in and make them do things. They can't do that. They can give them money, but they can't make them spend it. It's like, I believe Trudeau is saying, I'm going to go out and I'm going to hire X number of dollars or doctors. He's not going to hire a single doctor.
Yeah.
He is going to hand money out to the provinces with the hope that the provinces hire doctors. The province has that authority. Tekla.
I have a question about Afghanistan. It seems that our government cut back and there are a lot of people left behind there. What would the PPC have done differently?
Well, the first thing we would have done was we would not have called an election.
Yeah.
They had ample time. They were informed early that the Americans were going to pull out. There was actually a timeline that the American government under Biden had stated that the Americans will be pulling out by a certain date. Justin Trudeau knew this. He knew this before he called this election. This is a vanity election. This is to serve his own emotions, his emotional needs. And he didn't have to do it now. He could have waited 3 weeks. He could have waited, 2 more years. But he decided to do it, and he allowed this crisis to develop when it shouldn't have. He should have been responsible as a prime minister and focus the resources, the necessary resources, and have them in place instead of calling an election. Calling an election, we had nobody there. There was nobody coordinating anything. We had to work through the Americans to get our planes there, to get the people out, some of the people out that we did get out, but we left many, many behind. And it was just irresponsible on his part. And I think it just shows the kind of caring liberal government that we've been experiencing all along. Any more questions? I was not aware beforehand. They call it obstetrics. They shut down the obstetrics ward, which is the maternity ward at Norfolk General Hospital. This has been shut down now. They're saying because they have a shortage of staff. I can tell you, as I say, the time that I was there, I worked in the emerge closely with nurses, and it was hard for those nurses to get full-time employment at the hospital. The way that the provincial government has been managing the budgets and the cutbacks that they've had, most of the nurses or many of them, were part-time. And we've had issues where we had nurse practitioners at one time, and then the province pulls the budget on that, and they're all let go. It's a problem. So to see more services being cut out, we shouldn't be surprised by that. We should be alarmed by that. We need to do something, certainly, with the province. It's a provincial issue, and you have to get hold of them. Doug Ford is not doing a good job.
Yeah. Ken, I've got a question.
Yes.
I know a lot of people who are here, and ourselves included, we're people of faith, with deep faith convictions. And how is your vision for Canada to ensure that for ourselves and for our children that we can raise them in accordance with our faith convictions?
Yes, that's something that many people have felt under threat. It kind of brought itself to a head during this COVID lockdown crisis. And not so far from us, in Elmer, Harry Hildebrandt, he had his, I watched it on TV live. They were filming or streaming live on the internet, and the police came and they shut down the church. We have a constitutional right to our faith and to practice our faith, and that has been put under threat.
Yeah.
This is a problem. When we lose our charter rights, when you take Section 1 of the charter and you apply it and then you abuse it, this is not the Canadian way. This is not what we had built this country for, the Constitution and the charter. This is an abuse of power. This is an authoritarian abuse of power. What we're doing, what you're doing now by being here, by asking these questions, is you're doing the pushback, the necessary pushback. And I can tell you that I am fully on board on the idea of taking our charter rights and making them permanent, put a permanency in there, and rework that Section 1 of the charter. That caveat does not belong in our charter. Mm-hmm. Freedoms and rights cannot be played with, should not be played with, and we have to take them back. And we will do that. I guarantee you that a PPC party candidate elected will push for that, and we will hold the other parties' feet to the fire on our constitutional rights and our charter rights, our freedoms. Yes. It's a foundational thing. Everything works off it. Yes. Well, that's an excellent question.
That's a good question.
She asked about the UN and our obligations to the UN and our nation-state status. We're losing our nation-state status. We are giving away our sovereign authority to the bureaucrats in the United Nations. Let me start by, again, bringing our great conservative candidate, Leslie Lewis, into the discussion. She is a lawyer. She is an international lawyer. I read her dissertation for the University of York, which she wrote in 2019. It's 374 pages. Within that dissertation, she is arguing that Canadians need and should, certainly the spirit of her argument is that we should be paying environmental taxes, and we should be paying more environmental taxes to subsidize and to support a regime of paying for the upgrade of the electrical grid system of sub-Sahara Africa. She chose that for her dissertation, and she used Guyana as an example of where Canada can best apply itself. Her only concerns on this was not that you would pay more taxes and you would have more environmental taxes imposed, but that it might be seen under GATT or some of the other international trade treaties as a subsidization. And they were looking to create, it's a complicated thing, a tripartite system with private investors. And that was her concern. But throughout, and it is salted throughout her whole argument, that Canada is a player through our foreign development programs, and that we need to direct the carbon taxes through the Paris Agreement, where we lose our sovereignty, you are correct, more environmental taxes, and pay to bring the developing nations up to standard while we pay more taxes. So that's the argument that we have there. This is a very critical election because we are at a crossroads on whether or not we are going to be a nation state, free and individual, or whether we are going to join this new group, this compact, this global compact that's being developed. Within her dissertation, she repeatedly refers to Agenda 2030. And I know in the past, Agenda 2030 has been spoken about, certainly on the internet and in the legacy medias. Well, if you speak about that, that's kind of conspiratorial. You shouldn't talk about that. But it's written right into her dissertation, which may be one of the reasons why they've sent her down here. They thought this was a safe riding for conservatives, but the conservatives have long stopped being conservative. Look what they have not done in conserving our nation state and our own view of ourselves. We've had cancel culture and Antifa move in and make changes within our own communities. We've watched statues of our first prime minister torn down or removed by municipalities. We've watched Egerton Ryerson, and we've watched his statue torn down. For good, bad, or indifferent, this is nothing but the mob taking control. And they're also going to change our textbooks. And we are going to learn this new cancel culture lesson. This is very dangerous stuff because we're going to forget who our heroes were. We're going to forget the good works that our previous generations have done and our prime ministers. I've read some of the writings from Sir John A. Macdonald, and I have at home an original Hansard from 1877, where he's speaking about the expansion of Canada as we were just going into Manitoba. And this is not a man who's talking radical ideas or separation. This is a man who's looking to build and unify a country that has yet to be formed. Yet today, we're allowing the mob to tell us what our history was, who we are, and give us a new narrative. And that narrative will be a globalist narrative, and it will take away from our understanding of who we are. And we've got a lot to be proud of in this nation. We've done a lot of good. We've made mistakes. You know, we can talk about the residential schools.
Yeah.
You know, let's have that conversation. We've had mistakes, but were they intended mistakes? I'm not so sure. It's a lot of, it was something that should never have been done.
No.
In today's understanding, we wouldn't do that. It's just simply wrong. And there's still unanswered questions as to why there was no compensation, why those young children were not, even after deceased, sent home. And the federal government wouldn't pay for it in a day. Unanswered questions. Was it intended? Back then, back in the day, tuberculosis was a terrible, terrible disease. I know within my own family, several of my family members from way back, they got tuberculosis. Some of them were scarred for life. It scars your lungs. And if you're lucky enough to survive, you're disabled for life. These diseases impacted on the First Nations people far more greater. In fact, multitudes more of impact on them. And yet, But we have to remember also, these were people of their age that were making the decisions, and the wrong decisions, but their decisions. Back then, we didn't know what vitamins were. We didn't start to understand what vitamins were until the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So medicine has moved along, and we try to make judgments with 21st century eyes. We have to go back and make understandings through the eyes of the people at the time and listen to what their intentions were on building these systems. They were wrong. We have to learn from this, and we must never do this again. But we need to put responsibility where it belongs, not where it doesn't. I hope somewhere in there I've answered your question about nationalism. Yes, I'm a nationalist, and I support this country. I love this country. I have family that have fought in most of the wars. And what I see happening now, it's changing, it's different. I don't recognize it anymore, and I can't give to my children or my grandchildren what I had as a young boy. And that's disturbing. We need to turn this around now. Yes.
I don't know if I can put Cole on the spot. When you're talking about our forefathers and some of, I know this is a big issue for a lot of people, and it's something that I've wrestled with. And how do I even, I'm homeschooling my kids. How do I teach them about our country and have that tension with what our history is? And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on, as a nation, how do we move forward productively and in unity and not harm our first peoples in doing so? I don't know if I'm allowed to put you on the spot. If you're comfortable, but you can pass.
Well, come up here and answer that.
He's comfortable putting him on the spot.
And unity, you use the correct word. How do we go forward together?
Yeah.
Not separate, not opposed, but together. And for some of the debate and discussion that will go on, it's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
And some of it we're not going to like. But that's the great thing about a free, open, democratic society that doesn't censor and allows free speech, is you have these discussions. And that's what we need. So, in this discussion, we may hear stuff we don't want to hear. Well, that couldn't have happened. Maybe it did happen.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it. Yes, Cole.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks for that question. There's a lot of hypersensitivity when it comes to these issues, such as some of the darker parts of our history. And there's been a huge spotlight on these issues with the residential schools this past year. And as Ken was saying, this is something that should not have happened.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we need to learn from, and something that we need to make sure does not happen again to our future, our children now and our children of the future. And myself, my immediate family, our ancestors, they were not put into these residential schools. We were fortunate that way. I do sympathize for our First Nations people who had to go through some of these experiences. And the thing to remember is there's a lot of focus on the negative. Now, I'm not trying to discount any of the horror stories we've heard from some of the survivors or the records from these children that were in these schools, some that were able to escape they're in their late stages of life now. But you look at some of the accounts with some of the people who went to these schools, and there needs to be accountability on both sides. This was not just the Canadians at the time responsible for this. There was a lot of bad actors at play, and you know what? The same people that were responsible for some of these atrocities back then are responsible for the same atrocities that are happening now. These people like to say phrases that sound like buzzwords, like "every child matters," and they'll focus on the past. We cannot change the past. As I said, we can only learn from it. And it's really hypocritical to be saying every child matters, while today our children are suffering undue mental health issues, depression, anxiety from being locked down. They're not able to participate in normal society. They're shut out from their peers. Instead, we have to learn from that history. And right now, seeing the state that our children are in and what they've had to put up with, if you're saying every child matters, then why are these people whether it's the conservatives, the liberals, anyone in government, the media, or these activists, where's their concern for our children of today? And that's where we need to put our focus on. As I've said, yes, this was a horrible atrocity, it should never happen, and we'll fight to make sure this doesn't happen again. But when you're toppling statues, rewriting history, and removing pages from our history, that's only gonna open up the possibilities for this to be happening again. And we're already seeing some of the foundation being laid up again for this type of assault on it's the most precious members of our society. So it's a loaded question, but you know what? We need to be able to have these difficult conversations and find ways that we can move forward together. There's a lot of positive things we can do in our current situation for our children and our future generations. This country, as I was trying to touch on earlier, this was built on two very different worldviews. When the early settlers came over to North America, there was a great deal of mutual respect and appreciation for our very diverse worldviews we had. These cultures came together. There was a lot of intermarriage that went on. So obviously that tells me that there was a great deal of, as I said, understanding and respect for one another. It wasn't until a liberal government implemented the Indian Act that actually provided the conditions and the legislation to be able to take our Indigenous children and put them into these residential schools. So it's funny how history repeats itself, because now we have Trudeau that has pushed through the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We do not need an unelected foreign body telling us in Canada what we owe to our Indigenous peoples, or First Nations as I like to call them. And one of the reasons I make this point is because if you look at the definition of Indigenous, it's purposely and extremely vague. It does not delineate any specific race of people. This is global legislation. This is anti-Canadian legislation. This is opening up our borders, disturbing our property rights in Canada. This is gonna allow, my fear is this is gonna allow anyone in the world to self-identify as an Indigenous person, to be able to make a territorial claim or historical claim to any parcel of land, whether it's in Canada, the United States, or Australia, any of these nations that are currently subscribed to the United Nations. So this is, as I said, this is gonna be an assault on our property rights. This is gonna stop critical infrastructure from taking place, whether it's our pipelines, our highways, our housing developments. We do not need the United Nations telling us how to respect human rights and our rights and freedoms in Canada. We already have a Charter of Rights, we already have a Bill of Rights. Our nation was founded way before the conception of the United Nations. And if you look at who's running the show at the United Nations, it's some of the world's worst human rights abusers.
Yeah.
So, as I said, we need to have these difficult conversations. And myself, I am totally for having this discussion on abolishing the Indian Act, which is a historically racist piece of legislation. If you want to talk about anything that's racist, the Indian Act is a great example. And furthermore, I'll continue to push to have the conversations on making sure that we repeal and leave the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People.
Thank you, Cole. He's a wealth of information. You look at his age, and you have to close your eyes, and you hear this wise voice. A wise voice that sounds like a radio voice. I wish I had that myself. But Cole's, when I first met him, it came across very quickly that he's very thoughtful. He's deep in the issues, and he thinks them through. He's no fool, and you're not going to confuse him. He's a good person to have in the House of Commons. I'm hoping that we do get him up there, and he's a voice of reason that will help steer us through these conversations, these difficult conversations that we are going to have to make things right. And yes, he's correct. The Indian Act must go. It is racist. It is part of the policy of the People's Party of Canada to do just that. So thank you, Cole. That's a great question. And you're right, everything we touch is going to be affected by the carbon tax because society is run on energy. And society best runs on inexpensive energy. Carbon tax is a tax that is not going to do what they claim it will do. It is not going to bring about climate change in the opposite direction to where the climate change is deciding to take itself. This is arrogance on the Liberals' part and on the Conservatives' part. I can tell you right now that we will remove the carbon tax and all carbon taxes. And we're going to bring the jobs back. Carbon tax is a multiplier job killer, and it will lower your standard of living dramatically in ways that we